Hello, and welcome to the next installment of Law & Order, the video series where I look at and unpack stories from games. In this one we'll be looking at Amnesia Rebirth. This is the last Amnesia video in this series, as we've already done the Dark Descent, Justine and A Machine for Pigs, and you can find those videos down in the description. Watching the Dark Descent video is a good idea if you aren't aware of the plot, as it leads nicely into this one. This game, Rebirth, takes place 98 years after the events in Brennenburg Castle, where we played as Daniel. If you haven't played this game, there'll be spoilers in this video, so please be warned. Let's dive in. It's March 1937. Anastasia Trianon, also known as Tassie, is a passenger on a plane along with the rest of the crew from her expedition. Tassie and her husband Salim recently lost their young child Alice to a mysterious illness, so for them, at least, it's nice to have the distraction and to keep them busy. The plane, the Cassandra, was chartered by the Triple Crown Mining Company and was en route from Algiers to French Sudan, which is now known as Mali. Salim is nervous about the flight after some rough turbulence, and eventually his fears become realised after the plane's engine malfunctions and crashes into the Algerian desert, killing the pilot, Nicolas Masson. Now let's pause real quick. From the moment that the plane crashed until Tassie wakes up and finds herself in the plane suffering from amnesia, a lot of stuff actually happened. But we'll go through the game as it plays out and discuss what happened to Tassie afterwards. Let's continue. Tassie wakes up and, as mentioned, is suffering from amnesia. All she remembers is the crash. Seeing a bottle of laudanum, she recalled the doctor, Dr. Anton Metzier, told her that it can help her with her phobia. She exits the remnants of the plane and none of the crew or her colleagues are there. Walking across the baking hot desert sands, she comes across an old cave which has lots of evidence that her crew were there at some point. She finds the bodies of two of her colleagues, Lucas Ritter, who dies as a result of the crash, and his wife Eva, who overdosed of laudanum, which basically acts as a poison in high doses. Anyway, Tassie, after finding notes from her husband, ventures further into the caves and she finds tribal markings which seem to mention a guardian by the name of Tin Hinan. Tassie realises that she is wearing a contraption on her wrist which is, bizarrely, able to open what are called rifts, or tears in the real world, which allow travel to another world entirely. This world is called the Otherworld. Tassie recalls that she is in fact pregnant. However, after passing through the other world, she discovers that she is already showing. She is a lot further along than she recalls. But not long after this, Tassie is distraught to find the dead body of Salim, who had succumbed to his wounds from the plane crash. Realising that she has to move on, Tassie leaves Salim and tries to find her colleagues. She exits the cave system and finds an old abandoned French fort used by the French Foreign Legion. Inside, in the buildings, she hears a radio which features the voice of Dr. Metzier and Yasmin Shabani, the air hostess from the plane. Tassie needs to get to the radio to make contact with Dr. Metzier. Whilst attempting to make contact, Tassie travels further into the fort and keeps seeing something in there with her. Something not entirely human. The members of the French Foreign Legion who were in the building have also been brutally killed. Tassie reaches the radio and Dr. Metzier says that they are in a nearby village and Tassie can get to them beyond the gate. Tassie recalls that she and some of their expedition were in this fort previously, but some of them were injured by the creature Tassie has been seeing. After being chased by said creature, Tassie makes it outside. She attempts to lead through the gate but it's locked, and after obtaining a shell, she fires it from a tank cannon, destroying the gate. However, the tank falls through the ground in a cave-in, and Tassie is now trapped in an otherworldly structure built by a now extinct group, or a race called the Gate Builders. Tassie has to descend this structure and eventually escapes back into the desert, arriving in a place called the Oasis, which she recalls visiting before with the expedition. She makes contact with Dr. Metzier, who tells Tassie to head towards the smoke, which she sees in the distance. Upon heading towards the smoke though, in typical horror fashion, the sand gives way and Tassie ends back in the other world again. At some point, whilst attempting to pass through a rift, Tassie picks up an orb and unwittingly unleashes a red fleshy substance which seems to pursue her. It gets even weirder. Tassie realises that she is now 6 months pregnant. She finds more ruins, and in these ruins are the remnants of an expedition and its camp. Tassie needs to power the portal in order to reach the village where Dr. Metzier is. On her travels to find a power source, she comes across a member of their group, Leon, who is somehow turning into a horrifying ghoul. She gives him the slip and finds a power source, but in the process the red fleshy substance catches up with her again and prevents her from leaving, and the ruins collapse even further and Tassie has to avoid waking up loads of sleeping ghouls whilst crawling through the ruins and gets back to the portal. After powering up the contraption with the use of the orb, she is sent to somewhere else entirely, a completely different location in the other world. Tassie finds a contraption which allows her to be scanned, X-rayed. The scan reveals the baby inside her is afflicted with the very same disease as her deceased daughter Alice had. Throughout her journey, Tassie is kept seeing a strange spirit known as Empress Tihana guiding her somewhere. Tihana tells Tassie that in order to save her baby, she needs a substance called vitae, which is essentially the essence of a human being, extracted while the subject is under intense torture, pain, and fear. Later on, Tassie reaches an area where she's able to torture someone, as this is the method for extracting this vitae. After choosing whether or not to spare this poor gentleman, Tassie encounters a terrifying new enemy, a wraith. After travelling through the other world and reaching another rift, Tassie is able to get back to the real world, and, perfect timing, she's going into labour. She runs across the desert and finally makes it to the village, but it's completely deserted. Creepy, even. She discovers that everyone is dead, killed. She gets caught in a trap and is helped down by Yasmin, who is turning into a ghoul just like Leon did. Yasmin helps Tassie down from the trap but pleads with her to run before she loses control of herself. Tassie runs, but Yasmin catches up with her, and Yasmin is shot by Dr. Metzier. Metzier moves Tassie to a nearby cave so Tassie can give birth, and she gives birth to a baby Amari. But the doctor had tied her up and he runs off with Amari along with Tassie's amulet. Tassie gets free and chases Dr. Metzier into a nearby rift back into the other world.
Don't hurt her!
Tassie eventually catches up with Metzier, who appears to be pleading with a non-responsive Empress Tihana, and Tassie kills him. Empress Tihana, in her spectral form with her real form above her, appears and informs Tassie that the only way to save Amari is by using vitae, and that the only way Tassie can save Amari is to leave her with the Empress. So Tassie is led to Amari by the Empress, lets her hold her, and Tassie has a choice to make. This choice will affect Tassie's future and also that of Amari's. Tassie can leave Amari with the Empress, but even though she does this, the Empress attacks Tassie and turns her into a ghoul, and she is doomed to roam the other world with only her fading memories while she watches from the shadows as Amari grows up. Another option is that Tassie can leave with Amari and they are both able to escape to Paris, but Amari's sickness still remains, so the future is uncertain, and, of course, World War II is on the horizon, so Tassie will have to deal with Nazi occupation of France whilst caring for a sick child. The final, official choice is to use a nearby power cell along with an injector to corrupt the Empress and the vitae supply with an infection. Empress Tihana is killed, but Tassie and Amari are also killed. The fleshy red substance then takes over the entirety of the Dark World. There is a fourth, secret ending, which is basically that if Tassie fails to avoid the Empress's gaze whilst escaping, she will just be corrupted and forced to return to Amari's crib against her own will, which then essentially just leads to the first ending where Tassie turns into a ghoul. So that's the end of the game. I guess you could say that the truest canon ending is Tassie escaping back to Paris with Amari despite the uncertainty of the future, with Empress Tihana still ruling over the other world, as I guess this restores some kind of balance. But we do have a lot to discuss here, so let's begin. I've been referring to the Shadow as the fleshy red substance. Those of you who played the Dark Descent will be aware of the Shadow, which pursued Daniel throughout his time in Brennenburg. The Shadow was a protector of orbs. I'll explain orbs in more detail in the Dark Descent video, but in short, these orbs were linked in some way to the ancient religion of Mithraism, where a deity named Mithra was worshipped. The orbs were considered Mithraic holy artifacts. The Shadow was likely a creation of Mithra as a way of protecting these holy artifacts. Daniel, the protagonist from the Dark Descent, said that his orb that he recovered from Algeria cast a dark shadow, that by simply touching the orb you invoke the powers within it, and it will devour you if you're too weak to handle it. The Shadow follows after the orb, killing anyone in its way, determined to reclaim said orb. And this is why the Shadow so ferociously hunts Tassie after she takes the orb from the alchemist's chambers, as these orbs were being studied by the alchemists along with the Shadow and its properties. Empress Tihana was one of the imperial bloodline rulers of the Otherworld. Before Tihana ruled, the Otherworld was ruled by Empress Atua, Tihana's mother. They were part of the Unaya bloodline. Tihana would then become the new Empress after Atua died. There was a coronation, at which Tihana would be coronated in the presence of 7 orbs. But the Empress, despite all her power, only wanted one single thing: motherhood. She had a plan to marry a prince who could give her what she desired, a child, but none of these princes would do. Eventually Tihana would develop a strange illness, an affliction, and this is where the Vitae comes in. Due to this illness, the Empress used Vitae as a potential treatment for her affliction, and this gave her immortality. Now again, those of you who are familiar with the story of the Dark Descent will be well aware of the use of Vitae by Alexander and Daniel. That the Vitae needed would be extracted from people, or rather living beings, who are under extreme fear and distress, and the most effective method for this would be torture. Empress Tihana realised this, and the only way to maintain this immortality was to use subjects and torture them, extracting the Vitae. The only problem was that the Empress needed large amounts of it. Another problem was that her disease ruined her womb, which all but destroyed her chances of conceiving a child. The Empress became physically crippled as the disease took over and it progressed, and the Empress literally couldn't move, as seen here, but she was able to appear in a spectral form, and this was how Tasi was able to see and encounter her. Factories were created in order to supply the Empress with her much needed Vitae, but it's a lot darker than that. Many subjects were captured by ghouls and hooked up, stored in machines, and they were slowly and persistently tortured, giving off a steady supply of Vitae. Naturally, the extraction of Vitae was too far for some in the Otherworld, and a sort of revolt happened. A group of saboteurs led by someone named Kita, one of the alchemists, sabotaged the Great Gate, the portal which allowed travel to other places. The saboteurs' plan was to infect the Vitae supply with the shadow, but this didn't kill Tihana at all. Kita attached himself to one of the Vitae supplies as a way to stay alive whilst he came up with a new plan to stop the extraction of Vitae. That was, of course, until Tasi came across him. She took the Leyden jar as a power source, and this shut off Kita's life support, killing him. Anyway, all their plan did was cause the destruction of their planet, and as a result of this, the alchemists became wraiths, and they, along with the ghouls, would extract Vitae for the Empress. I'm sure the Empress was very much aware that their world was almost completely destroyed, yet she was still desperate for a child. So naturally, as with all these games, most of the significant stuff happened before the game's actual events, and information about what happened is usually located in notes, flashbacks, and during conversations, and horror games, due to their content and their scare factor, can cause people to miss certain things. So after the plane crashed into the desert, the crew, some of whom died judging from these graves, made their way to the nearby cave. They were being led by Hank, the expedition's leader. What was left of the group pushed onto the fortress, and as we know, the group was attacked by a creature there, which was a ghoul. Hank was very badly wounded by the attack. Dying, and well aware that he was dying, Hank led the group to an area called the Oasis, and this is where they first encountered the Empress, who took the group through to the Otherworld by guiding the group to a traveller's locket which they used to travel through. This also explains why Tasi had it on her wrist when waking up in the plane. Now remember I said the Empress wanted only one thing? A child? Well, the reason that the Empress appeared to the group was that she sensed the presence of a fetus, Tasi's unborn fetus. The Empress, now with the group in the Otherworld, makes Tasi an offer. She can heal Hank and the rest of the crew, but in exchange they would stay until Tasi's child was born and must give her child to the Empress. The crew were very pushy and tried to force Tasi to agree, but she refused. I mean, who could blame her? Especially considering she had literally just lost her daughter Alice. This also gives the basis and the reason behind why the leftovers of the people that Tasi comes across in the game seem to absolutely despise her. For example, Richard Fairchild, who attacked Tasi after she freed him, and Leon de Vries, who even referred to her as that French bitch. The Empress was disappointed, but invited the crew to drink from a fountain, and this would save them all. The entire crew, including Tasi, drank from the shrine's fountain. This healed all their wounds pretty much instantly and took away any need for food and drink, which is one of the reasons that Tasi, who would normally have been very thirsty in the desert, refused to drink water at the fortress, saying that she wasn't even thirsty or hungry.
I'm just not thirsty. I should be, I know, but I don't think I can stomach it.
Anyway, the kind gesture by the Empress was actually a trick. She had started the process of turning them all into harvesters, or ghouls, which explains why Tasi encounters her crewmates turning into horrific creatures, and why she herself was experiencing strange symptoms and blackouts. Hank was one of the ones that began to turn first. He still had some control of himself and begged Tasi to run. Hank then lost control of himself, and another crewmate named Malik Tambora sacrificed himself to help Tasi escape from the underworld, and he was killed by Hank. Hank then judging by this, decided to hang himself in an elevator shaft, and then Tassi comes across him in the latter stages of the game. Pretty shocking. Tassi then went back to the crashed Cassandra and passed out, with the effects of her harvester transformation causing her memory loss or amnesia. This then leads us into the events of the game. Now on to Alexander of Brennenburg, one of the antagonists in the Dark Descent. Again, those of you familiar with the story in the Dark Descent will know that Alexander of Brennenburg wasn't human. He came from the Otherworld. He was banished. In this note from the Dark Descent, Alexander expresses a desire to reunite with his love. I mean, he was also in danger from the Order of the Black Eagle, a chivalrous order in the Kingdom of Prussia. If you want to know more about him, go and watch the Dark Descent video, but ultimately we don't ever actually find out who his love is or was. There really isn't any clear indication or record of an Alexander existing in the other world, but there is this. One of the alchemists working and researching orbs and vitae was an alchemist named Iandra. Now we find out from notes that Iandra was described as being someone who was actually banished from somewhere called the Enkindled Fortress for unknown crimes, and this apostate begged for sanctuary in the Empress's city referred to as the Empire. As a way of buying his way to sanctuary, Iandra revealed that he had invented a concoction which would effectively erase the memory of a victim, allowing for more effective extraction of vitae due to the subject not remembering or being able to recall their past torture. Therefore, their fear each time was fresh. Iandra thought that he had bought safety for himself, that is until the truth of his crimes were discovered whilst residing in the Empire, and he was exiled permanently. This bears great similarities to Alexander's story. Alexander also knew about how to harvest vitae from victims and thus taught this to Daniel. Alexander was exiled for unknown crimes, and Alexander also knew how to make the Amnesia potion and used it between torture sessions to maximize vitae production. So we talked about Alexander and him potentially being Iandra, but we are also aware that Alexander had in his possession at some point a traveller's locket, same as Tassi's, but that he lost it. There was a workaround by using an orb and coercing its power out of it using vitae, hence the torture, until one of his friends, Johann Weyer, escaped through the portal with the orb, therefore ending any chance of him getting back to his home world. This brings us on to the expedition led by Professor Thurston Herbert in 1839. As we discussed in the Justine video, the expedition had links to Justine through Justine's father, Monsieur Florbel, as Herbert had written to him requesting permits for the expedition. Obviously he wouldn't get a reply as Justine had killed her father. Anyway, they were hard at work when Daniel entered a tomb, the doorway of the tomb collapsed and Daniel was trapped inside. Daniel, whilst waiting for rescue, discovered an orb and was eventually rescued, but he'd shattered the orb by accident. Daniel was sent home by Herbert with the broken pieces of said orb, but Daniel discovered he was in danger after being pursued by the Shadow, and then he wrote to people asking for help. Alexander answered. I won't discuss it in too much detail here, but the Shadow chased Daniel back to London and then on to Castle Brennenburg, and Alexander used Daniel's orb. Back in Algeria, Herbert and his crew kept at work. He was looking for a traveller's locket. The men working with him were very concerned and were losing their minds. Herbert then managed to find another orb. You can guess what happened. Herbert tried to use the orb and the Shadow was unleashed once again, with Herbert in its sights. Some of the men were all killed brutally by the orb, and Herbert believed that this was an attempt by the remaining men to sabotage the expedition.
20th May, 1839. Those imbeciles. How dare they sacrifice my expedition to their superstition? The camp is in chaos, and they blame the orb. They won't get their hands on it. I shot one of them to put them in their place. It can't be helped. They are animals, all of them. They killed 4 men in the most gruesome way. Their skinless bodies torn apart. They say the desert took them. But I know murder when I see it. I have sent Abdullah to contact the French in Algiers. 22nd May, 1839. That thing is after me. It's been hunting me for days, but I keep out of its trail, so I will persevere. I can see a settlement at the edge of the desert. I'm getting closer. I can see it, but it is not me. It is Abdullah. Through his eyes I see, his mind I hear. Confined to myself, I see only death, dressed in the orb's darkest shadow.
Whilst this was happening, the expedition was completely obliterated by the Shadow. Tassie comes across the remains of Herbert whilst in the Otherworld. Somehow, Herbert found a way to escape the shadow through a rift. However, because he didn't have a traveller's locket, he couldn't get back. He tried, but failed, and eventually died from starvation and dehydration. I'm really glad that this game managed to tie off this particular loose end, and when I came across Professor Herbert in the Dark World, being a massive Amnesia fan, I thought this was a really cool touch. At some point in the game we find this note by Professor Herbert. It references Hinan, who, as the legend tells it, was a Berber princess who almost perished in the wilderness until she apparently found a source of food, or some grain, in the desert, survived and founded a confederation called the Tuareg. From this, in 1750, a tribe called the Kel Ahagar, a tribe which inhabited the Hogar Mountains, was established. I believe the fictional in-game Tuareg tribe called the Kel Hinan is based off of this tribe. The tribe referred to Hinan as the Mother of Tents, or the Mother of us all, their guardian spirit. This tribe even refused the call of Islam to follow Hinan instead, as Hinan became a Tuareg queen. At some point, Hinan died and was buried in a tomb. This is actually a real tomb located in Abalessa, an oasis, and excavated in 1925, with various excavations dating all the way until 1933. Although being dated back to the 4th century, Daniel actually believed the tomb was much older. We never actually fully see the inside of it, but we do see part of it through the eyes of Daniel when he discovered the orb in the tomb's orb chamber. The tomb actually contained 2 orbs, but obviously the real one didn't. This just helped towards an important part of the game's story. So also part of the game's story is the involvement of the French Foreign Legion in the fort. The Kel Hinan were fiercely protective of Hinan, and as a result, they were seen as savages by the French Foreign Legion, who of course were stationed at the fort. It seems like they were further excavating the tomb of Hinan. Wounds from the Legion tell us that the Kel Hinan skinned 2 of the Legion's men and rubbed salt into their wounds in the name of their Great Mother. This note also talks of some men wanting to get revenge and slaughter the Kel Hinan. Whilst Tassie is in the fort, we can see how that went, or rather how it didn't go. It seems that the Legion were excavating and they broke through to an underground chamber. Some of the men appear to have been lynched, some have been brutally killed, and some notes say that it's some kind of animal attack. So what exactly happened? It's not clear whether the Kel Hinan were responsible at all, but messages from Captain Lefebvre seem to suggest that combat took place between his men and the tribe at some point, but I don't think that the Kel Hinan were directly responsible for what happened to the Legion. This note tells us that one of the Legion was found down in the cistern, but that another soldier has deserted his post. They suspected an argument and an accidental killing, but the suspect likely booked it out of there and didn't return after the deceased Legion member was attacked by something. Their excavation into the lower chambers likely released a ghoul into the fort which slaughtered some of the men. The men were, as a result, jumping at shadows with every noise noted as a potential animal, a lion or a jackal. It's likely that paranoia and madness drove them to attack one another. The Otherworld, also called Zazura, Eden, or the Dark World, is an ancient world. Its inhabitants are humanoid, and one of their features which indicate this is their blue ghostly skin. As we have already discussed, the shadow wreaked havoc upon the Otherworld, killing a lot of its inhabitants. They appeared to potentially speak a few languages, judging from these tablets. Their civilization heavily utilised technology and alchemy, and their technology far surpassed that of technology on Earth at the time. One of these examples of their technology was to use portals to travel to different places, as used by Tassie. Lastly, their concept of time was very different to time on Earth. Daniel, whilst trapped in the tomb, mentions that it took them an hour to rescue him, but to him, it only felt like a few minutes. This is best shown with Tassie's pregnancy. She goes from barely showing to being 9 months pregnant and giving birth within the space of a few hours. As a final thought, despite the mixed reviews, I actually really enjoyed this game, and I was really glad that Frictional Games were back on board to develop Rebirth instead of the Chinese room who developed A Machine for Pigs. But that's it for this video. If you did enjoy this one, then please leave a like and subscribe if you're not already, and leave a comment down below with your thoughts. But for now, take care and I'll see you in the next one.